that the then Prime Minister David Lloyd George, in a speech in Carnarvon in his native Wales on the evening of 9th of November 1920. In it, he defended the policy of reprisals against the Irish civilian population, which were universally recognised as illegal, and the other excesses that Crown forces had perpetrated over the previous year and more, on the basis that those forces were opposed by a handful of assassins, a real murder gang, by terrorists who preyed as much, if not more, on their own community as on their opponents, and who only understood the logic of violence. There was much more of the same language in the speech, none of it constructive, and all of it redolent of the inflammatory rhetoric used by the most choleric elements of the die-hard wing of the British Conservative Party, with whom Lloyd George was in coalition. In the days after the speech, fellow Liberals denounced his speech as in effect substituting anarchy for government. Had such critics been privy to the confidential British Army assessments of the capabilities of their Irish Republican adversaries, which were being supplied to Lloyd George and his cabinet colleagues, they would have had even more cause for concern, for they would have realised that the departure point of Lloyd George's analysis, such as it was not simply flawed, but the inverse of reality. Consider, for example, the report by General Shaw on the present state of Ireland, dated 27th of March 1920, i.e. in the immediate aftermath of the killing of Lord Mayor Thomas McCurtain, when the local RIC most certainly did act as a murder gang, and submitted to the British Cabinet a month later. General Shaw was the then General Officer commanding the British Army in Ireland, albeit he was just about to be replaced by the better-known General Neville Macready. As such, he was uniquely well positioned to offer a professional opinion on the military threat posed by the IRA. General Shaw was, to state the obvious, and to put it mildly, no friend of Irish republicanism. As such, his words carry all the more weight, for they told a very different story than that peddled by the Prime Minister. The report covered a wide range of areas, retrospective, prospective and contemporary. But it is his observations on the military capability of the Irish volunteers that is most relevant for our purposes. He said, speaking of those volunteers in the aftermath of the Easter Rising, and what follows is an extended quote, "Clever men at the head of the rebel movement saw clearly that without a better organisation they had no chance of success, and the leniency with which they were treated and the sympathy which they received encouraged them to hope that they would be able to train and organise without serious interference. They were justified in their confidence." This is the key section. "The system which they have built up is a remarkable one. The so-called Irish Republican Army is organised and commanded in a manner which would be creditable to highly trained military experts. Its communication and intelligence services are most efficient, and its discipline leaves little to be desired. It is only want of armament which has prevented the Irish Republican Army from becoming a most formidable and open enemy." The conclusion is obvious and inescapable. 7 months before his Carnarvon speech, Prime Minister Lloyd George and the other members of his cabinet had been told by the senior British soldier in Ireland that not alone was the IRA a real army, it was in critical respects a very good army. One that was in this respect at least as good as the one that he himself commanded, and which, were it to acquire weaponry on a par with its discipline and leadership, might prove itself its superior. It was a cool, professional appraisal, and was as far removed from the chaotic, ill-disciplined murder gang thesis as it is possible to imagine. Now, on its own, this assessment would be significant, but not decisive. It could be argued, for example, that the IRA was then at the zenith of its influence, that the effectiveness of the British response to the challenge it posed had yet to become manifest, that the IRA would be forced onto the defensive and begin to disintegrate in the summer of 1921. Well, if anyone was tempted to put forward such a hypothesis, they would have to seek to defend it against at least two compelling pieces of evidence to the contrary, again supplied from within senior ranks of the British Army. The first comes from the aforementioned General Neville Macready, who was even less well disposed towards the IRA than his predecessor. Hostile though he was, even he could not deny the reality of the strain that the IRA campaign had put on the troops under his command. In an assessment dated the 23rd of May 1921, he stated that in respect to the British garrison in Ireland, either victory over the IRA had to be achieved by October that year, and this is a quote, or steps must be taken to relieve practically the whole of the troops, together with the great majority of the commanders and their staffs. He was, and again this is a quote, quite aware that troops do not exist to do this, but felt prepared to share with the cabinet his view that unless a total shake-up of the garrison was undertaken, many officers would be rendered unfit for command for a considerable time, and many enlisted men would be rendered unfit to serve at all. But could such a victory have been won if the government had followed Macready's advice and launched an all-out, all-arms offensive against the IRA in the summer of 1921? Well, no, at least not in that timescale, according to another senior officer, on this occasion one who was not stationed in Ireland, but who undertook a whistle-stop tour of inspection in the country in the middle of June 1921. Colonel, subsequently Lieutenant General Sir Hugh Ellis, had been the first commander of the British Tank Corps during the First World War and still occupied this position at the time of his inspection. He enjoyed considerable prestige within the army owing to the dramatic impact his tanks had made on the Western Front in 1917-1918, and his report was considered sufficiently weighty to warrant distribution amongst the cabinet within 10 days of his tour. What did it say? Ellis was very clear. He described the position in which the British Army in Ireland found itself as so much worse than anything he had imagined that he believed there were few members of that force stationed outside Ireland who comprehended just how bad it really was. The British Army, in his view, was not on the verge of victory. It was not even winning the war. If anything, it was on the defensive. To use his phrase, and this is a quote, the British Army in Ireland is besieged. Troops were sleeping in defended barracks behind barbed wire. There was no rear area in which rest and recovery was possible. Movement by road was becoming increasingly difficult, with very slow armed trains the only practical alternative. Communications between various units, even in the basic task of distributing orders, had become so laborious that the army was reduced in effect to sending such messages in person, medieval style. Ellis stated that he only met one senior officer who was optimistic, and even he, Ellis believed, was of his own right because his position required. His professional opinion, in contrast to Macready's, was that a truly all-out campaign by the British Army might bring victory, not in 3 months, but at minimum 2 years. But it was his concluding one-line paragraph that was the most devastating assessment of the state of the war in Ireland at that moment. It ran thus: I am strongly reminded of certain phases of the Third Battle of Ypres, that is, Passchendaele, a word that even today sends a chill down the collective spine of the British Army, but it connotes a literal and metaphorical floundering in the mud, a senseless waste of life with no direction of operations evident at any point in the chain of command, and a passive acceptance of wherever the fates of war would decide. For someone such as Ellis, who had fought at Passchendaele, there could be no more damning criticism of the situation in which the British Army found itself in Ireland in the summer of 1921. We know, of course, that the war did not last for another 2 months, 3 months, or 2 years, but was concluded within a month with the truce of the 11th of July. But if anything, this declaration compounded the problems faced by the British Army, and it is here that we start to come to a conclusion and bring the discussion back to Clonmult. General Macready, on whose shoulders the negotiation and implementation of the pact fell, was acutely conscious that the very act of concluding such a truce implied that both parties, the Irish Republican Army and the British Army, were legitimate military entities, and this was something he was loath to concede. The reason for this was contained in a summary of the arrangements leading to the truce that he sent to London the day after it came into force. The relevant paragraph ran thus: "In everything that has been officially said or done during the last few days, I have been careful to ensure that there should be nothing which might in any way be interpreted as a recognition of the Irish Republican Army as a belligerent force. I consider this of prime importance, as such apparent recognition would have a most disastrous effect on any future operation which may become necessary should negotiations break down." The term belligerent force is a key concept in military law, for it connotes, in common language, a lawful combatant, as opposed to bandits or indeed murder gangs. Macready, for all his insistence that he personally did not recognise the IRA as such a belligerent force, knew all too well that his government, in sanctioning the truce, had done so. But what did this mean? Well, what Macready feared was that in the event of a resumption of hostilities, captured members of the IRA could not be treated as criminals, could not be court-martialed or interned, and certainly could not be executed. They would have to be treated as prisoners of war in line with the Geneva Convention. We are not here concerned with the resumption of the war that of course never happened, though it was threatened by the British side in treaty negotiations on the morning of 6th of December 1921. But what the recognition of the IRA as a belligerent force connoted about everything that had gone before, including Clonmult. The IRA had not instantly become a belligerent force, a legitimate army, at the moment the truce was agreed or came into force. It had already clearly been one in June 1921, when Colonel Ellis recognised that it was besieging the British Army in Ireland. More importantly, it had been recognised as a properly constituted and damn good army by General Shaw, Macready's predecessor as Commander-in-Chief in Ireland, over a full year before, in March 1920. Indeed, in Shaw's view, it had been thus since the aftermath of the 1916 Rising. What is the conclusion I draw from these confidential analyses offered by senior British officers, insofar as they have a bearing on the events at Clonmult and its aftermath? It is simple, that the Irish volunteers who served there were not thugs. They were not assassins. They were not part of a murder gang. They were soldiers of the Irish Republican Army and were captured while undertaking military activities during a justified war of independence. As such, they were entitled to prisoner of war status. Not alone did they not receive it, they were illegally tried and illegally punished, and a number were illegally executed. As such, they were victims of a heinous war crime. When viewed in this light, David Lloyd George was indeed correct when he spoke of assassins at work in Ireland, of criminals being allowed to get away scot-free, of a force seeking to cow the local population into passive submission. The trouble for him was that the real murder gang in those days served in the ranks of the British Army. But I do not want to finish on a negative note, and I do not want to finish with my gaze set on London rather than Cork. I therefore conclude with a simple statement of fact. The men we remember today were and are heroes, and the heroic manner in which they lived their lives and gave those lives for the cause of Irish freedom should and will be the abiding memory that persists when all the controversies surrounding their deaths have faded away. God bless them, and God bless their memory.